Good morning. Good morning and welcome to today's edition of Eurofund's Ask the Expert. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Today is our first opportunity really to put on the table the results from our unique European Working Conditions telephone survey. And we are delighted to be able to explore that today and have a discussion with you on this unique survey from Eurofund. My name is Mary McCaughey. I'm Head of Information and Communication here at Eurofund. And today is the day when really we want to delve into the detail of some of the findings that we have discovered and have been elaborated in terms of the Working Conditions Survey. The findings from this survey, which is a highly representative survey drawing from over 70,000 workers across 36 European countries, they allow us to really explore the wide-ranging picture of job quality across these countries, across occupations and sectors, across gender and age groups. But particularly in this context, it is in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. This survey took place during this time, and as a result, it is a working conditions telephone survey, as distinct from the previous European working conditions surveys. And this period during the pandemic was a particular point in time, as we're all aware. It changed the way we live, it changed the way we work, and it really allowed us to see how, in fact, the COVID-19 pandemic impacted so badly and so difficultly on jobs, on women, on men, on different occupations and sectors. It's allowing us to really, I suppose, present a new future for how we will work into the next phase. And I suppose it has made us change and reassess the way we perceive so many aspects of our working lives. In this particular context, we want to be looking about job quality, its role in ensuring this good working life, and seeing how that has changed during this pandemic period. I suppose we also want to, in today's discussion, elaborate a little bit more on how persistent gender divides and segregation in sectors, in occupations and workplaces have changed or have been impacted by this period, and how workers have experienced the pandemic in terms of the gender dimension. So we've a lot to cover in today's webinar, in our Ask the Expert, and I am delighted to be joined today by our experts in this area, our Senior Research Manager, Agnès Parent-Thirion, who has been leading this project, and in fact has been leading this project on working conditions and the Working Conditions Survey over many years. And she will talk to us a lot about job quality and all of the elements of job quality that Eurofund has been working on for so many years. And also to our research manager, Jorge Cabrita, who is going to really delve into the critical aspect of gender equality. And that is essentially the focus of our Ask the Expert today. It is looking at the key ingredients for the future of work, how we can see them in terms of job quality and in terms of gender equality. So these are clearly highly important issues for us to be debating today, and we're delighted to have so many of you join us. We would like you to join the chat online. It's important that you put your questions to the experts, and you can follow us on social also on #AskTheExpert on job quality, gender equality, and EWCTS. You can follow us on all our social channels, and of course, you will be able to follow us later on YouTube. So Agnès, let us delve immediately into the questions at hand, and can we talk a little bit about job quality and what this Working Conditions telephone survey has told us about job quality?
Thank you, Mary, and good morning, everybody. Very pleased to be here today. So it was a very special context in which we carried the survey, because it was during the pandemic and we had to adapt our survey infrastructure to collect the data. And we moved into telephone. We also innovated in the sense that we are using this OECD framework to measure job quality. So what did we learn? Job quality still played its protective role during the pandemic. And this for us was very important because all across the years, we've seen that job quality was obviously good for health. That's why we designed it, but also was good for work-life balance, engagement and motivation at the workplace, trust and cooperation in workplaces, work-life balance and security. And during the pandemic, job quality continued to play its role. So that was for us a wonderful confirmation of the role of job quality. But, what we also realized, this was a time of tension, a time of difficulty, and we have 30% of workers in Europe who do not experience job quality. They are in a situation that we call job strain. And in this situation of job strain, they put their health and well-being at risk. And that is quite important, this 30% of...
So there, Agnès, you're saying that 30% of all workers that responded to this survey indicated that they were in fact experiencing bad job quality.
Exactly. And so why were they experiencing bad job quality? How do we know? It's because for job quality, it's a question of balance between the good and the bad things. And, no situation at work is very perfect. The problem is when you have too many job demands, that is, things that increase the risk for bad health or that, use up your energy. When you have too many job demands in relation to the job resources, the training, the organizational participation, the social support, building on your intrinsic motivation to work. So when the balance doesn't go right, then people are in job strain. They don't have enough resources to compensate for the risk, and this put their health and well-being at risk. Who were these people who experienced these job strains? Well, if you look by sector, it was mostly health, which is, in the context of the pandemic, quite an issue. And this is a group of strong policy interest at the moment with the care strategy, the mental health, and labor shortages. So health, experienced a lot of job strain, but also transportation, So we have a male and a female sector that experience job strain.
And is this what we're calling here, Agnès, the essential services to a large degree? They were the ones that you're referring to here.
Exactly. And if you look at the survey data, we can look at them through our traditional angle, or we can look at them with a pandemic angle. And when we constructed groups of workers that represented, how they address the pandemic. So one of them was frontline worker, and they experienced a high level of a job strain. Mm-hmm. A second one was on location service worker, what in some countries they've called second line workers, for example, people working in supermarkets. The third group is people who worked from home. And the fourth group is people who continue to go to manufacture and plants. So we have these four groups of workers, and the frontline worker are the one who experience the most the highest level of job strain. Workers working from home experienced the least. They had to undergo a lot of adjustment, and we can learn from this adjustment, and we can learn, moving forward to setting up, a good hybrid work that work for workers and companies, but they experience a little bit less.
But then, of course, lots of jobs don't lend themselves to being remote. So therefore, you're talking about different types of jobs, different types of occupations, different types of sectors that encourage or facilitate that.
Yeah, and that is... Yeah. This is the issue. So in Eurofund, we've had some colleagues working on teleworkability. So in general, we assess 35% of the job to be teleworkable. This may be a little bit more of task in people's job that are teleworkable. So, this is one of the strengths of the survey to allow to quantify, how big are the different groups, because during the pandemic, we didn't have the data infrastructure to have this, wide-ranging and representative survey. So indeed, this is one of the important findings of the survey to say, well, there were 32% of workers who were working from home or in an hybrid format. This is their working condition. This is a job quality. It was more gender mix, but there are these other groups, frontline worker and on-location workers. And these groups of workers still experience challenging working conditions, and we should not forget them.
Okay, and in terms of how we see this pan out between, for example, you've talked about sectors and the types of jobs that were impacted here, but also in terms of men and women, and we'll come back to this with Jorge in terms of the gender segregation and the impact on the gender divide. But just in terms of, do we find more women in these job strain occupations, or is it evenly divided?
We do indeed. We have 30% on average of workers in this job strain, so that put their health and well-being at risk, that experience some health issues, including mental health. 29% of them are men, and 32% of them are women. So yes, indeed, women experience more job strain in 21 than men. And this is a very important issue for us.
Yeah. So still a gender divide, even at the level of job strain and job quality. We're also looking at that. And in terms of any good news stories that you've seen within this job quality context, where are the well-resourced jobs?
Yeah. Well, I think there are two good news stories. The first one for me is that it works. Even in the context of crisis, having a job of good job quality, help you access work-life balance, help companies having a productive and engaged workforce, protect your health and well-being, help in financial security. So I think this is the first good news, that job quality, helps and supports, a good working life. The second, the second good news is that if 30%, had experienced job strain, 70% did not experience it, and these jobs are mostly in financial services, the banks that we're talking a lot at the moment, education. This remained the good job in general.
Okay, well, that's a good setting the scene for us in that context, Agnès. Maybe I can just briefly move over, because we're in that sort of gender area, Jorge, and we've talked about the main ingredients that we hope will be in place for, a positive future of work. We've defined job quality for all of these reasons, that there's 30%, that's a huge amount when you think about the individuals that accounts for, and we need to address that. And clearly the ripple knock-on effects are something that we'll come back to later for society at large. But we also have talked in the past about gender divides. There's the employment gender gap, there's the pay gender gap, but here we're also talking about gender segregation at the workplace and how that can play a role. And what have you been able to draw from the survey when it looks at this particular aspect?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much, Mary, for your question. Indeed, through our data, the data from the working conditions survey, we can, first of all, confirm that there is gender segregation at sectoral level, at occupational level, and more than that, we can also delve a little bit into what's happening at the workplace level. So we managed to, through our questionnaire, ask respondents to give us an estimate of the share of female co-workers in their workplace. And what we see is that more than 60% of men and more than 60% of women actually indicated that most of their co-workers are of the same gender. They are respectively men or women. So the level of segregation comes actually down from the sectoral level, the occupational level, also to the workplace level. Overall, we are talking about only 20% of workers reporting working in gender mixed workplaces, where there's a more or less equal balance between men and women in terms of co-workers. And that's really, really interesting and different from the type of data that we talk about usually, which talks about sectors and occupations.
And in terms of the kind of jobs that we're still seeing women in, the survey tells you a little bit about that. Can you elaborate a little bit just to kind of paint the picture of where women are in the workplace?
Of course. So the first thing that we have to, perhaps the starting point is that we have to think in terms of gender segregation at the sectoral level. So if we look from that perspective, we can see that there's still a lot of sectors which are predominantly male. So we are talking about over 80% of the workers in industry, for example, or construction or transports. Most of those, so more than 80% of those workers are men, actually. Mm-hmm. Whereas in sectors such as education or health, those are predominantly occupied by women. Then this translates into occupations. So if you think about occupations such as drivers or builders, so workers that work in the transport sector or in the construction, most of them are men. So it's a large share of these workers are actually men. Whereas if you think about other occupations such as, for example, nurses, or even a different example here, cleaners or helpers, those occupations are predominantly occupied by women, actually. So there's a big divide there. And what I would like to underline here as well, in relation to this divide in terms of occupations, is the big segregation that we still see in terms of management. So whereas we can see that in general there's more and more women becoming managers, and that's a positive development, actually, we can see that the share of managers is still very, very low. So the share of women who are managers is still lower compared with their male counterparts. Overall, we can say that according to our data, 2/3, so more than 66% of the workforce, as a man, as a boss, as a manager, or a supervisor. Only 20% of the male workers have a woman as a boss. This is quite telling about the divide that we have in our workplaces these days.
Right. So only 20% of men have women as a boss. So that's something that would imply that most women are managing women then.
Actually, what we see among women is that half of them have women as managers, but also the other half, of course, as men as managers. So it's women are in this case kind of in a more egalitarian situation, whereas men are predominantly in a male-dominated world, if you wish.
Okay. And tell me, in terms of this segregation, I mean, how does that play out? How does that impact, for example, in terms of the distribution of working time, at the workplace for both male and female?
Yeah. So the most important thing that we have to derive from this perspective is that, so on the one hand, men and women are exposed to different kinds of working conditions, right? So different kinds of risks, different kinds of working conditions in their different situations. The working time is perhaps the most visible aspect of this gender segregation. And what we can see is that basically, and that this is, I think, the bottom line, which actually we talked about a couple of weeks ago in our podcast about the topic. We can see that men tend to spend more time in paid work than women do on average. In the European Union, we're talking about 6 hours per week more, whereas women tend to spend more time in doing carrying out unpaid work.
Yeah.
So we are talking about a difference of 13 hours per week that women do more than men in terms of unpaid work. Overall, this translates into a difference of 7 hours per week more for women. So if we take everything all together, paid work and unpaid work, and by unpaid work here I'm referring to caring for family members, doing housework, for example, or cleaning. So if we put all these things together with the paid work, the jobs that people have, we are talking about women doing on average 7 hours per week more than men do. If you translate this into an yearly figure, we are talking about more than 8 weeks of 40 hours that women are doing more than men every single year on average. And that's quite telling. Also important is to understand that these figures differ according to the composition of the household. So if workers have children, for example, or if they have to care for other members of the family, they tend to spend much more time in care or for children or for other members. And we see that working women, for example, in the group of 35 to 44 years of age, they spend 11 hours more per week taking care of children than men of the same age. So this is quite telling as well of the type of divides that we can see outside of work, which also impacts overall in gender equality.
What is that then? 8 full weeks in terms of the actual cutoff between men and women in terms of what women do when you add unpaid and paid work together. 8
That's
full
correct.
weeks at the end
That's
of the
correct, Mary. Yeah. So if you take everything all together, and if you take up that average and you multiply, in this case, we used 48 weeks, not 52, because we also want people to go on leave and to have some rest.
Yeah.
But if you use that as an estimate, you reach very quickly above the equivalent of 4 weeks of work per year that women end up doing more than men.
And I suppose that's kind of a stark statistic just in its own right, but the implications of that are quite, strong as well in terms of what that means. What have we lost in terms of what could have been done during that time, or what women could have contributed if they were not involved in that kind of unpaid work to that degree as distinct from men. So it further exacerbates that gender equality is at other levels of society.
Absolutely. If you take the concept of cost of opportunity, right? You can imagine the amount of things that could have been done with a better share of paid and unpaid work between women and men, actually. So, the loss of talent, the skills that people actually acquire and developing in their homes or in other activities that they have in their lives, that ends up actually lost to a great extent, especially on the side of women, of course. And that's really, really important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll move on here, but I mean, just before, there's a good question that's just come in from Katya in Glasgow, and she's saying, are you aware of any effective policies at the workplace or that have been implemented to mitigate or at least account for the extra unpaid work that female workers do? Now, you may not be aware of them, but perhaps there's some examples that you have to hand.
That's actually a very, very good question. I mean, I could not give you a particular example, but we know that, and actually through making reference to our data, we know that those workplaces where men and women benefit from having some flexibility in terms of their working hours. So if they can take a couple of hours, for example, to look after, family or social affairs, we know that this has a strict and direct positive impact in terms of work-life balance, reduction of work-life conflict. And so I'm sure there are some examples there. Perhaps that's something that we should take note for further research from our side. But yeah, that's what we can tell from our data.
Okay, and just like moving into that, Agnès, to come back to that, and you mentioned earlier these 4 groups of workers that we were referencing in the survey. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about what was different for them in terms of job quality and why that impacts it with respect to the kind of care thing we're talking about here and the unpaid work?
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Mary. So as I said, we had identified 4 groups of workers, people working from home. And for them, the challenge was to this integration of work life with private life, but it was mostly in the same place, especially at the times where schools were online. The workers in this group, which included the home workers and the hybrid workers, they had they underwent a lot of changes in their work activity because they had to adapt to hybrid work. From a job quality perspective, they were quite supported by their colleagues, by their managers, and everybody tried to make it happen quite well. But they suffered from social isolation. They report less level of engagement than the other group, and they were doing some of the unpaid work. still substantially, but it was less than, for example, the frontline workers or all the workers that had to go to a site, because this worker had to go to their employers, they had to do their work, and then when they came back, they still had to do what needed to be done at home. So it was a dual demand, and especially when the pandemic was very active and we didn't know as much on the virus. People were afraid they would bring in the virus to their homes. So that created a bit of a extra work, apart from the fear and the guilt. And maybe George would like to give us the data on the amount of unpaid work that it added to these different groups of workers.
So our data, in terms of these four groups of workers, what it shows is that basically frontline workers, actually together with on-location production workers, they put on many more hours than the other groups do. So, and what is particularly worrying here is that especially women, so the female workers, the female frontline workers, they have the longest overall hours of all the groups. So we are talking about much more than 70 hours per week, including paid work with unpaid work. And this is kind of worrying because these are the people that actually were looking after our health and the functioning of our societies during the pandemic. So these were people that were kind of putting the most time, let's say, into all the work that needs to be done, both in terms of paid work, so working for others, caring for others, for example, but also looking after their own. And this is quite revealing that these people were certainly struggling during the pandemic. We are talking about data from 2021. So this is right in the middle of the pandemic. And it's quite telling of the challenges and difficulties that they were going through that period of time.
And I suppose that data is very specific to this context of COVID, but I assume the idea of health workers and those who are at the front line, some of that holds true from previous surveys, which were not telephone surveys, that we see similar data, certainly in terms of the gender dimension, but also in terms of their exposure to these kind of risks.
Yeah, and this is really true. So during the pandemic, nurses, for example, to take, this occupation, the level of job strain was 60%. So 6 out of 10 have put their health and well-being at risk because of work. And we've looked at nurses, and their exposure to the different risks and the different resources. And, nurses is a job which is both physical, so you have exposure to, the manipulation risk, your exposure to physical risk, for example, infectious disease, but it's a job of relations, so you are in contact with people. And this is quite striking that even during the pandemic, nurses experienced quite a high level of intimidation and violence at the workplace. So this is a risk, but that risk remained during the pandemic. And then the issue is with the pandemic, there was a lot of changes in the work organization. So, this normally translates into both learning, so higher cognitive demands, but also work intensification. So we had all of this. But it's true that, this is something that we had seen in the past, that, nurses and more generally people in the health sector were experiencing this type of risk. And this is very much a concern for us. We have a European care strategy, we have labor shortages, and we know that there is a global labor shortages of the health professionals. And, if we're not able to give them proper working conditions, how will they stay in the sector and how will we attract new workers in the sectors?
And that feeds into the whole conversation about the skills debate, which is, this is the European Year of Skills. How do you close the skills gap is one thing, but certainly it's also about working conditions and the quality of work, because if we don't fix that, we will be as skilled as is necessary, but we won't be able to attract these workers to these particular sectors if we don't improve the conditions available to them. And we did recently, just for those of you who are interested, we published a data story which gives you detailed information on the adverse social behaviour impacts that frontline workers and women in particular experience, which I think is an interesting place to go. I mean, just on this though, perhaps are you able, Jorge, maybe to detail a little bit the national differences, not in great detail, but just to maybe give us the top and bottom rankings when it comes to gendered allocation of time to unpaid care work? That comes from Eloisa asking that question.
Sure, Mary, thanks so much. And hello, Eloisa, thanks for your question. Indeed, I don't have the full pack of information here, but we see a big variation in terms of countries. So yes, there's some variation. So the gender gaps in total hours range from only 3 hours, around 3 hours in Luxembourg and France, for example, up to 17 hours in Croatia. So these are kind of our minima and our maxima in this distribution. So there's a nice chart that I would recommend you to have a look at in our report, where you can see actually the differences in terms of unpaid work and paid work, with the size of the full difference by country in this nice chart. So
that's great, Jorge. I'll get our colleagues perhaps online on the chat to provide that to the participants so that they can see that. I mean, I'm going to move away from this fascinating gender discussion and also on the job quality dimensions of that, and maybe just to move on to something which is equally fascinating and certainly very much in the zeitgeist at the moment. Particularly this week, we saw the IPCC report published on climate change. And one might think off the top of our heads that the Working Conditions Telephone Survey doesn't give us very much detail in this area or any data that's relevant to climate change, but not so. Can you tell us a little bit here about how job quality can play a role in terms of the green transition? And talk to us a little bit about job quality of the kind of thing that we talk about when we talk about green jobs. Jorge, do you want to start us off?
Of course. Thanks, Mary, because that's actually a very interesting topic as well. So we tried to explore a little bit the possibilities within the limitations of the Working Conditions Telephone Survey data, and see what we could extract from it in terms of the relevance of job quality for the green transition. And what we were basically able to do, based on previous research, of course, especially on this idea of greening of occupation, we were able to identify 3 groups of occupations, so 3 groups of workers within our workforce, basically. And we are talking about workers in occupations which can be seen as new or emerging jobs. So jobs which will be created during this green transition will most likely be allocated to this set of occupations, and that represents roughly 9% of our working population. We identified a second group, which is called enhanced skills occupations. So these are workers in jobs which very likely will receive some sort of training or additional skills in order to follow up on the greening transition. And this is roughly a 14% share of our workforce. And there's a third group, which we call increased demand occupations or jobs, which is basically those occupations that, although they don't require changes in their tasks or their skills or knowledge required to do their jobs, the demand of those services will increase during the green transition. And this is a group that represents roughly 15% of the workforce. So what we see in these groups in terms of job quality is that the job quality varies a lot between them. And the good news is that the new and emerging jobs actually show above average job quality. So they do much better, they fare much better than the others. But the other side of the coin is that the group of increased demand, they fare much worse, and actually worse than average in comparison with the other groups. So basically, if we go ahead and kind of going forward with the green transition, if we manage to get more of these new and emerging jobs, that will entail actually a general improvement of job quality. But if we see also an increase of these increased demand jobs, which fare a little bit worse in terms of job quality, then that positive evolution can be dampened, actually. So it's important that we ensure that this transition actually entails job quality for all, including these groups that will be in principle directly impacted. And I
That's
would like to add,
George. Yeah, just on that, to be clear, what you're saying is that there's a potential divide there between the new and emerging green jobs, which are high quality, well-resourced jobs,
right.
and then those that exist currently but will require more demands, more intensity at work, less autonomy. Is that what you're talking about? Those jobs are the ones that we need to be concerned about, that they are improved.
Exactly. So if we don't do anything to deal with them, basically what we will see is most likely a growth of this kind of jobs as well, because there's an increased demand for them. And if they continue with the same type of job quality, this will kind of in overall kind of worsen the overall situation. And that's a bit concerning. So we have to aim for a situation in which looks like the new and emerging jobs, actually. So with improved job quality. What I would like to Mary, the gender implications, because we have been talking about gender, right? So I want to plug in this here as well, because it's really important, and I would like our audience to have an idea of the potential gender implications of this. So these groups that we identified, they are mostly male composed. So that we are talking mostly about male occupations. So these occupations likely to be impacted by the green transition, they represent a mere 20% of the female workers in total, but we are talking about 50% of the male working population. So there's clearly a high potential, a great potential for a gendered impact of the green transition if we don't address gender equality on the one hand and job quality on the other hand as well.
So green jobs equals another gender-dominated sector, which is male?
Most likely, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
In general terms, we could say that, yeah.
I'll come back to you for some good news later, Jorge. Can we move into another area, or would you like to add anything to that, Agnès, just in terms of the green?
Yeah, maybe I would. I would like to add two things. The first one is, we're embarking on this transition, and it will impact on the structure of our jobs. So this issue of green jobs, and the decrease with the other one, but it will also impact on everybody's job quality. And some occupations will be most affected by, the physical risk linked to climate. So it is important in this context that we continue and we monitor actively job quality as we are embarking on this transition, so that we can assess to what extent people are being exposed to more risk. And the second point, which I'd like to make, which is more of a positive one, and something that we see in all our research, is that change don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in companies with a certain type of work organizations. And we have seen in a lot of our research over the years, and confirmed in the EWCTS, that there are some forms of work organization that are more conducive to learning, to making sure that the tacit knowledge owned by workers, can feed into the adaptation. So these organizations, they go through different names, but high involvement or learning organization. Mm-hmm. So it is very important in the context of decarbonization, but digitalization, that we see, how we can, through the, together within companies, support an adaptation to the change, which will go hand in hand with, well-being, but also productivity and the performance of the company.
So again, it's about this joined up approach, this holistic attitude to tackling these different elements to ensure that we improve job quality, which of course has ripple effects across all these other elements in our lives, which sometimes we're not entirely even fully focused on. I mean, that's something that I wanted to just dovetail into before we go to some more of the questions here is, we've seen the change in the way we work. We've seen that, more remote working was absolutely imperative during the pandemic, and that has carried on to a large degree post-pandemic. There's there's been some research done on what that would mean in terms of the green transition. Will it contribute to the climate change agenda? And I think the jury is out there, actually. But there's also been this move towards the 4-day week. I mean, we know in France, for example, there were initiatives well back, but it seems to have come onto the agenda a little bit more in recent times as a result of where we are in terms of the future of work. Do you see evidence for this, or do you see anything interesting in the survey results that could help contribute to this debate, George?
I think I can chip in onto that one, Mary. Thanks. Yes, indeed, we try to have a look at our data from the job quality point of view as well, and see what we can say about the usual days of work. What is important so the starting point is from which this discussion should kind of take place, is that we must be aware that 70% of the workforce in Europe still works 5 days per week, usually. So this is the norm, let's say, for our European context. So this means that there's a great potential for the expansion of the 4-day week model, right? So that's a good starting point. But then when we look at those working 4 days a week, usually, we see that this is a very tiny group at the moment. So in 2021, we are talking about 8% of the work population. So it's a rather small group. But more important than that is to note that, first of all, we are talking about different shares of men and women. So it's 6% of men working usually 4 days a week, 10% of women. So there's already a gender difference there. But what is also interesting to note is that these people are more likely to be in strained jobs than those working 5 days per week. Okay, so this is a bit concerning. So what we can say from this is that we have to be careful in the discussion of this kind of model, the 4-day weeks model, because in order to result, we have to talk about, first of all, an effective reduction of working hours without pay reduction, which is not conducive to an increase of the work intensity. Okay, because if we go in the direction of what we see now in our data, that's not a good direction. We are talking about people reporting a high level of job strain, and this is very likely associated to higher work intensity. So the work that you would do in a normal 5-day week, you condense it into 4 days, and this puts pressure on people, including all sorts of risks, many of which Agnès already mentioned. So we have to be really careful in this analysis. It's not just about working hours, it's the amount of work that you can do in a 4-day week. Okay, Agnès, did you want to add anything in there in terms of the impact that you can see from the survey results here?
Yeah, well, so George has said it, the 4-day week, if it's not accompanied and supported by discussions with workers, adjustment in the working culture, the work organization is not a panacea in itself. So it's important that, workers, their representatives, are involved, and management in implementing the 4-day.
I suppose there, Agnès, also, we're not just talking about, a reduction of time available to work. I mean, people are also indicating that, certainly the new younger generation are looking perhaps for more meaningful work, work that actually gives them a sense of purpose, which I know you've looked at in terms of the job quality aspects in the survey. And I'd like you just to give me a bit of an insight, because I think we're looking at a generational shift post-pandemic, which certainly doesn't perceive work in the same way as was the case before. Have you any evidence to back that up?
Yeah, so for us, meaningful work is part of the job resources of workers. So this is part of what we call the intrinsic motivation. So what does it mean to be in a meaningful work? It means to do some work that you find useful, to be able to do quality work, and to be able to learn, and grow into the jobs. So the results in general are quite good. 70+% of workers in general feel that they are in this situation. There are 2 important issues that need to be said. The first one is that this is companies and workers can work on this usefulness of work. So it's not a given, it's something that is constructed, and there are ways to support it, but the usefulness can be challenged in complicated context. And when it is being challenged, then it is a strong source of mental health issues. It creates a performance problem for the companies. There have been a couple of scandals, for companies where, people as they were not able to do it, had to take ways, because they couldn't do quality work, they took short ways. So this is a very important issue to monitor. In terms of generational effect, the data don't show that much differences. Actually, what they show is that for older workers, it was easier to report it than younger workers. And we have to be to think very carefully about how young entrants make their way into companies, how we integrate them, how we mentor them and, make them part of our company, the culture. That would be one of my
advice for the future in terms of integrating younger people into the workforce. I want to take a couple of questions. I mean, one of the questions that came in earlier from Kenneth in Sweden was to what extent, he asks, will it, but the EWCTS cover self-employed and people in the precariat?
Maybe, Mary, I can say yes. The survey covers self-employed, temporary workers. In terms of job quality, there is a lot of heterogeneity within self-employed groups. So the self-employed with employees in general experience, higher job quality. This is consistent with findings across the year. Whereas solo self-employed, experience average job, proportion of job strengths. Temporary workers and in general, those with the shortest contract or with informal contracts experience more job strain. So this continue to make a difference in the experience of work.
Okay, and that will continue into the next iteration of the EWCS. Which will be in
24, and we're working very hard
already. Yes.
Yeah.
And a question here, George, from Dominique. Perhaps can you say something about the potential implication of the new directive on minimum wage and social dialogue on gender equality, on the gender wage gap and the gender employment gap?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. I suspect that the working conditions survey is not the best, let's say, tool to assess the impact. But I'm sure that in 2024 there are some indicators which are contained in the questionnaire of the working conditions survey that will eventually reflect the impact of these directives, because these are relatively recent pieces of legislation that that are being implemented at national level as we speak. So I think that in 2024 we will be in better shape to have a look at that impact. But maybe I can highlight that one of the interesting questions that we have in our questionnaire is about the ability of making ends meet. So it's not about the job and the amount that people are paid per se, but it's about the capacity of the respondent of our questionnaire, of our survey, in their household to be able to to pay their bills and to face their expenses. This is a very powerful indicator, and hopefully in 2024 and the following months we will be able to see some reflections of the implementation of this directive from that point of view as well, and eventually some improvement in the good direction, both in general terms but also in terms of the gender wage gap.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Because clearly one of the main objectives of the survey is to allow us to continue to monitor and track progress in all of the areas that we've discussed today, and to be able to use that data to feed it into the policy making process in a way that is useful and timely. I suppose I would just like to wrap up, or begin to wrap up now, in terms of what we've heard today already. We've talked an awful lot about the job quality framework, and in fact, there was one question here, which was asking Agnès for a bit of an elaboration on the OECD framework for job quality and how does Eurofins compare to that. So maybe you can just give us some response to that before we wrap up and do some takeaways from what we've heard today as part of the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. So, sorry, there's an echo? No, it's all good now. What we used to do in the past is, it was the same approach, the level of the job, the health impact, to select these characteristics of work and employment that made job quality, and the health impact was selected through high-level epidemiological studies with longitudinal approach, prospective studies. So it's the same indicators, so to say, but it's mostly about the combination and about the depth. So what we like in traditional Eurofound research, because we like to provide an extensive answer to policymakers, is to have more indicators. But the OECD provides, something which is a little bit more succinct in terms of coverage. So that was the first difference. But this indicator, they were selected because they had this the strongest impact on health and well-being. The second difference is about packaging. We used to, in our previous works, we were packaging by area of policy makings because we know that there are many policy areas that contribute to job quality. So we would look at physical risk, social dimension of work. So that's psychosocial risk is the policy agenda, training and learning. So that would be the skill agenda. That's how we would organize it. But here with this OECD indicators, we just look at them all together and we come with one number. So it's a different way of looking at it, packaging it, but basically it's like a Russian doll. It's embedded in the framework.
Okay, well, that takes us to good place. Thank you, Agnès. To look at some of the issues that we've discussed today, and maybe if I could ask both of you to really come up with, we usually ask for sort of 3 takeaways from these kind of discussions. And if you were to look at suggestions for policymakers, or indeed what you've taken away yourself as being the main points in terms of job quality and gender equality for the future of work, to maybe offset some of the issues that we have discussed here, and to see how we can improve things for implications for the future, not only of work, but also of society as a whole. So Agnès, maybe if you can take it away, and we'll maybe do 3. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah. My first point is all our work confirm the importance and relevance of job quality. It is a tool, it's something which is good in itself for the health and well-being of workers and, performance, but it also has implication for the household they belong to, our societies. So really, this is in our international, European and national policy frameworks, but this is really something that we need to continue. So I would I think it's very important that it continue to be monitored. As we have seen, there are many leverages to improve job quality, because you can decrease risk or you can increase, job resources. So I think this increased job resources, which is very much in line with the European Year of Skills, is very important. How can we develop policies and practices that allow workers, to be more able to do their work, that give them the resources so that they can do their work. So that would be very important that we develop these practices and in line with this. And the third point is we're embarking on a lot of changes, whether we call it polycrisis or in a more positive way, the triple transition. We're embarking on a lot of changes. Work, and the quality of work in general as a product, but also as an experience, will matter very much in how we are able to go on to the transition and the result of the transition. So ensuring that, this is done with job quality, will help us meet the demographic challenge, will help us assess whether we are doing it, we are adapting digital tools and digital practices, in the way that we want, and will also assist us in the decarbonization. So monitor, mainstream, develop.
Monitor, mainstream, develop. Okay, well, they're good pieces of advice, but I think what I take from your takeaway is how interconnected job quality is with so many elements of other policies that we talk about often distinctly from work quality, but quality of work. But I'm thinking there, for example, about work-life balance. I'm thinking about sustainable work. I'm thinking about, as you talk about their social cohesion. These are things that we need to talk about in a very sort of interdependent way, and job quality seems to be very pivotal to that. So more emphasis on job quality and improving that could actually have benefits which ripple widely into our society. So thank you. That's a fairly hefty takeaway to begin with, Agnès. Jorge, yours.
Yes, it's hard to follow, but
there's
the point I would like to make is related to this idea of unleashing the full potential of the in the European Union of our societies, of our people. And the point I would like to make is that we have to move away from the existing gender segregations at all levels in our labor markets, in our employment structures, in our workplaces, and we have to work towards more. We have to work more towards this idea of sustainable work over the life course. So, and this basically is represented by the idea that work needs to change according to people's needs. So we have different needs throughout our life, in terms of education, in terms of family, in terms of care work, in terms of long life learning, in terms of other spheres of our lives, and we have different needs at different times, at different stages of our lives. Work needs to adapt to that in order to make the best out of people's potential, and that's this idea of sustainable work over the life course. So we need an inclusive labor market. We need inclusive workplaces, which on the one hand support workers, so those that are already in the labor market, those that are already employed, when they need. So when workers have specific needs over the different stages of their lives, work should be there to support them. But at the same time, this labor market and these inclusive workplaces, they should create the conditions as well to activate those people that are at the margins of the labor market or actually outside of the labor market. And this includes people such as those with care responsibilities, those with chronic illnesses, for instance, or older people who face situations in which they are kind of excluded from the participation in the labor markets in employment, because there are no conditions for them to participate. And job quality also contributes to this inclusiveness. So there's a kind of a nice segue here between what Agnès said and this idea that we have to deal with the gender segregation in labor markets and workplaces and work towards this sustainability of work over the life courses.
No, absolutely. This life course perspective also, it requires a sort of a shared understanding of what that means over a longer period, where you may be caring for older people, for older parents, but you may be caring for younger, or indeed you may have other care and other responsibilities, and that we need to take account of that within, but we also need to share that responsibility, and that needs to be clear between men and women, going back to what you said earlier about the paid and unpaid work, and that the labour market needs to facilitate that. And I think that's a fairly good takeaway. So you matched it nearly, George. So in terms of the final one, and I'll ask you really to make this very brief because we're really 2 minutes out from the end. So what would be your final takeaway?
And it will be a shared takeaway so that we don't have to score points.
Excellent.
The final one is employee participation and employee representation is key to help address all these challenges, because they are one of the way to accommodate to the different the economic context and employment context of the companies, and they will help find the best solution for the company and the individuals at stake. And final word for George.
Thanks, Agnès. Just to follow up on that, I mean, it's really important to understand that we still have a number of people. It's around about 12% of our workforce of employees who do not have this kind of representation at their workplace. So neither trade union or works council or a similar type of representation, nor meetings where they can express their views on the changes, on what's happening in their companies or organizations. But this is even more worrying when we look at specifically at services workers. So returning to our groups of workers, the service workers, they have a share of 40% who do not have any representation at the workplace. So if we think about what kind of future we want and what kind of future we actually are making, if we take this into consideration, there's still a lot of work to do there, and try to improve at least this starting point, because it's a very important starting point, as Agnès said, employee representation at the workplace in order to deal with all these challenges. That's where we have to start.
Okay, a clear message there on participation and representation at the workplace to ensure that these dimensions are fully optimized. Again, I would move quickly into saying thank you all who have followed us today for your participation and representation in our Ask the Expert on the ingredients for the future of work, on job quality and gender equality. Thank you for engaging. Thank you for your questions. Thank you also to my excellent experts, Agnès and Jorge, for being with us here this morning. You can find all of this information on our website. You can continue to follow us on social. Please do check out our Eurofan Talks podcast, where you are here, Jorge, talking about gender segregation in more detail. And you can also listen to Barbara Gerstenberger on job quality, which was an earlier version of our Eurofan Talks podcast. Our Data Explorer would allow you online to be able to delve deep into the data that you've heard about today. And of course, for the rest of the year and ongoing, we will be promoting and presenting the findings and the discussions around these findings on our European Working Conditions Telephone Survey. Thank you for joining us today, and I wish you a very good afternoon.